Welcome everyone to today's event on implicit bias in STEM. This is part of a series of events on implicit bias in STEM, and today we're looking at the specific question of how pervasive implicit bias is in STEM. We'll be hearing from Dr. Leslie Ashburn-Nardo from IUPUI, Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. And in just a moment, I'll turn things over to our speaker and our event hosts so that they can introduce themselves and welcome you all to this event. For now, I want to welcome you on behalf of the CIRTL Network. If you are new to CIRTL or unfamiliar with it, we are the Center for the Integration of Research, Teaching, and Learning. We're a nationwide network of about 40 universities in the US and Canada working to teach STEM grad students and postdocs effective, inclusive teaching methods so that they can become both excellent researchers and teachers. And today's event, and in fact this entire month-long event series, is very much in the spirit of that goal. So thanks to the folks at Indiana University and IUPUI who are helping to bring this event to us. Thanks to you all for joining us online today. And I want to let folks know that they can learn more about what we do in the CIRTL Network at our website, which is linked at the bottom of this slide. And now, without further ado, I want to turn things over to our hosts for today's online event.
Thank you, Kate. Hi, everybody. My name is Jessica Alexander, and I'm an instructional consultant here at the Center for Teaching and Learning at IUPUI. And I am joined today by Caitlin Martin, who is a graduate student here at IUPUI who works in our teaching center, as well as Ann Borden, who is another graduate student at our teaching center. So now I'm going to turn it over to Ann, who's going to introduce our guest speaker today.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessica. As she said, my name is Ann Borden. I'm a graduate student and a teaching assistant here for CIRTL at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. Here at IUPUI, we celebrate the spirit of collaboration and inclusivity, and I am delighted to introduce our presenter, who is a pillar here at IUPUI, but also the psychology community. She is an associate professor of psychology and is currently the director of IUPUI's Applied Social and Organizational Psychology doctoral program and the Industrial Organizational Psychology master's program. Her work focuses on documenting the various ways that women, African Americans, and other underrepresented groups are stigmatized, as well as individual strategies that stigmatized targets and their allies can use to reduce prejudice and foster inclusivity. Her research has been funded by a variety of sources, including the National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Health. She has been recognized with numerous awards, including the IUPUI Chancellor's Diversity Scholar Award. She is a fellow of the Society of Experimental Social Psychology, the Midwestern Psychological Association, and the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. Currently, she is a consulting editor for the Journal of Cultural Diversity and Ethnic Minorities Psychology and the Journal of Sex Roles. I encourage all of you to visit her website to gain a deeper appreciation for the incredible work that she is committed to. And I am greatly honored to introduce to all of you Dr. Leslie Ashburn-Nardo. But real quick, before we hand it over to Dr. Ashburn-Nardo, we have a couple of activities that Jessica and Caitlin are going to begin now.
Great, thanks, Ann. So we have pulled up right here a box folder link. Everything you're going to need within our presentation today is at this link. Ann and Anusha, I believe, are going to post this link in the chat box. You can just click on it. But within this folder, we have our PowerPoint presentation, also a series of key terms, an empty outline that you can fill out as we go, a handout with some research highlights and references, and we'll mention those as we go through the slides. So we wanted to ask a series of poll questions just to get a better feel for our audience before we get started. Kate Diamond's going to help us to facilitate this poll. We're just asking how you identify in terms of your role. So A is for undergraduate student, B is graduate student, C is postdoctoral scholar, D faculty administrator, E other.
As a reminder, you can answer this poll question by going to that A icon at the top of your participant panel. If you're joining with a group or you're on a mobile device, you can let us know what your answer is in the chat window. Otherwise, please do try and use that polling tool so that we can compare who is who.
Great, so it looks like we got some responses. A few are still coming in. Oh, thanks, Kate. So it looks like predominantly B is the popular answer, which is graduate students. That's great. We're happy to hear that. None, too. That's interesting. So yeah, and D also looks like it's a big one for a faculty and administrator.
So overall, it looks like we have a good mix of people here, which is great. So our next poll that we'll be asking about is your discipline. So whether or not you're engineering, technology, another STEM discipline such as physics, chemistry, mathematics, or biology, or a non-STEM discipline such as the humanities or social sciences. So we'll give you about a minute here to answer this poll.
As a reminder, folks can answer the poll by going to the top of their participant panel and clicking on that A icon to select the appropriate answer from the drop-down menu. If you're joining with a group or from a mobile device and it's tough or not possible to do that, go ahead and let us know in the chat window.
Okay, so it looks like most people have responded, and it looks like about half of people here, 38 out of 78, are in other STEM disciplines, which is great. We also have a few people from engineering and technology, and we have a good number of people who are either in a non-STEM discipline or answered none. So even though the presentation today is focused on the pervasiveness of implicit bias in STEM, we definitely welcome everybody, and we're excited to have perspectives from outside of STEM itself. So welcome.
Okay, so we have one last question. Have you ever taken an implicit association test, which is referred to as the IAT? For example, Harvard's Project Implicit. This question is specific to Dr. Ashburn-Nardo's presentation. So go ahead and vote when you get a second.
And once again, this will be our last poll, so our last polling reminder. You can answer the poll by hovering over that A icon at the top of your participant panel and selecting your appropriate response from the drop-down menu below. If you're joining from a mobile device, that won't be possible, so let us know in the chat window. If you're joining from a group and it's complicated, let us know in the chat window.
So we have some responses that are still coming in, but it looks like the predominant answer is A. Yes, I have taken an IAT, which is great. Some of you have never heard of it, but Dr. Ashburn-Nardo will cover it briefly. We would highly recommend that you look into it after this presentation. And again, Dr. Ashburn-Nardo will talk more about that.
Yeah, and another thing that I'll just add here very quickly is that these tests are free to take. So this is a free resource that is available to you. So, you know, another reason that you might want to go ahead and look into that. So now that we've done some initial polls to gather some information about who you all are, we wanted to highlight some key terms here that some of you may or may not be familiar with, just to make sure that everyone is on the same page. So our first term is implicit bias, which are negative, unconscious associations or stereotypes, which are expressed automatically. And sometimes these are referred to as unconscious or hidden bias. The next term is equity, which is ensuring that all individuals have the resources that give them equal opportunities to be successful. So this is a little bit from equality, which is just treating everybody the same. So here you're you're not really treating everybody the same because someone else might need another resource from you to reach that same level of opportunity. Microaggressions are everyday insults, indignities, and demeaning messages that are sent to marginalized groups. Oppression occurs when a majority group's attitudes or behaviors perpetuate privilege and power over a minority group, and these can be either individual actions or behaviors, or they can also be institutional or systemic. And then finally, privilege is the unearned access to resources, benefits, or advantages that occur as a result of someone's position in a dominant social group.
And I would add to that too, there's a little asterisk at the bottom, but we have a list of key terms for all of our sessions within the box folder.
And there's also an empty outline that has these key terms on it, so you can write down the definitions there too, as well as maybe some examples of each of these as we're going throughout today's presentation. So our next slide has quite a bit of information on it, and again, we have another handout.
It's research highlights.
Which are the research highlights, which highlights each of these. So Caitlin and I are going to very briefly summarize all this. So how pervasive is implicit bias in STEM? So from the content here displayed in this first upper left-hand quadrant, for STEM course content and climate, there's been studies that have demonstrated that women and people of color leave the STEM disciplines at a greater rate versus their males and white or Asian peers respectively. However, utilizing strategies to improve the climate in the classroom can improve the retention for those students. For STEM, with regards to STEM assessment and evaluation, bias persists throughout all levels of education. So for high school students, female students and students of color are less likely to take AP exams in STEM. And then compared to their male peers, female applicants for faculties in medicine had weaker recommendation letters. So not only were these recommendation letters shorter, they also raised more doubts or criticisms versus males. So STEM employment and workplace. In the workforce, minorities tend to be hired at a lower rate and at a lower salary. Again, lots of studies have demonstrated this. They're also more likely to experience bias in their evaluations and more likely to have to prove their worth compared to their peers. Lastly, for STEM classroom interactions, STEM instructors and classmates do exhibit implicit bias. College students with racially or gender connotative names were less likely to receive a response from instructors when asking to set up an in-person meeting. And further, male students underestimate their female peers' competency in one study that looked at a biology class. Yeah, so as illustrated in these examples, implicit bias affects all areas of STEM, so not just those that occur in the classroom or through an instructor-to-student interaction. And importantly, even though some of these studies focus on, for example, the rate at which women or other minorities leave the STEM disciplines, these studies had a variety, had data that demonstrated that these discrepancies were really the result of an implicit bias. So now that we've reviewed some of that literature with you, we're now going to turn it over to Dr. Leslie Ashburn-Nardo, which is going to talk more about this topic as it relates to her research.
Thank you all so much. This is a test of my technological skills myself. I'm feeling a bit stereotyped threat right now, so hopefully people can hear me okay. I wanted to, first of all, thank Anne for her wonderful introduction. I would also, of course, like to thank the CIRTL Network for organizing and sponsoring this event, the IUPUI Center for Teaching and Learning for all of their help with this and many other times that I've relied on them for many things. The Associate Vice Chancellor for Graduate Education at IUPUI, Dr. Janice Blum, who invited me, and a host of collaborators and students and peers who are doing this good work. And of course, thank you all for attending. I was told to keep this kind of brief, so my overview is really simple. I'm going to highlight a few examples of gender disparities in academia and in STEM more specifically. As we've seen already from the slides, there are all kinds of other disparities that are very important to study, but lately in my work I've focused on gender disparities in STEM, so that will be the focus of my remarks today. And then in particular, I want to highlight what the role of subtle and even implicit gender biases are within these disparities. So I could go on. You saw that was a very fact-filled slide that was shown just before I started my presentation. There are all kinds of disparities that have been documented within the sciences and within academia. I figured that for most of us, especially given that we've got a large contingency of graduate students here, getting a job and keeping a job in research is probably of the utmost importance. So those are the different domains that I have selected to focus on for today. So when I think about research that shows biases or disparities with regard to getting a job in academic research, one of the studies that comes to mind first and foremost is one that was conducted and published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by my good friend and collaborator Corinne Mosser-Cusin back when she was a postdoc at Yale University. She's now on faculty at Skidmore College. And she and her collaborators at Yale were very interested in biases in general, and in particular they were struck by the fact that although we have such strong biases, such strong stereotypes about women's performance in the STEM disciplines, they could not find at that time, this was published in 2012, any research that specifically showed such biases among STEM faculty. So they conducted such a study in which they recruited faculty at research institutions. So they went straight to the folks who are kind of the gatekeepers for getting that first job within academia. And they focused specifically on the scientists that most of us think of when we think of scientists. So bench scientists like biologists, chemists, and physicists. And their sample of 127 faculty was pretty representative in terms of demographic averages. As it turns out, demographics really didn't matter. I'll share that with you here in just a second. But it was a pretty nationally representative kind of sample. So these faculty were told that they were taking part in kind of a study of that was designed to help facilitate the review of applicants in a mentoring program. And so their feedback on this would be very important for these graduate student candidates who are applying to lab manager positions. So they were led to believe that these were actual applicants. They were led to believe that this was, a very important kind of mentoring process, so it should have enhanced motivation to take this task very seriously. Now, all participants in this study received the same packet of materials to evaluate, but those materials were attributed either to a male or female student. So participants were randomly assigned to review materials that were attributed to John versus Jennifer. And then after reviewing the materials, which were cover letter, resume, the typical kinds of things that go into an application for a lab manager position, the respondents were asked to evaluate that candidate and provide feedback in terms of how competent the candidate appeared to be, how willing they would be to hire that person, what sort of starting salary would they offer that person, and their self-reported willingness to mentor that person. And so as you can see from this figure, no matter what the dependent variable was within their study, we can see that faculty favored the male student. They preferred the application that was attributed to John over Jennifer. And that was true, as we can see here, in terms of perceived competence. There's a significant difference where John was evaluated significantly more competently than Jennifer, more hireable than Jennifer, and faculty reported that they were significantly more willing to mentor John than to mentor Jennifer. When we take a look at salary, we see that same pattern there, where this was starting salary, and you can see that these faculty were willing to pay John versus Jennifer, despite their identical credentials and the same job that they were applying for, significantly more money. Now, interestingly, the results were the same regardless of the faculty participants' own gender. So male and female faculty members were equally biased in their evaluation of John versus Jennifer. And the one individual difference that did matter in their analyses was what we call the modern sexism scale scores, which modern sexism isn't exactly an implicit bias. It's not a reaction time kind of measure. So it's not truly a non-conscious process that's behind modern sexism, but it is considered a more subtle form of self-reported gender bias. As you can see from a couple of the sample items that I've provided here, society has reached the point where women and men have equal opportunities for achievement. To the extent that people endorse those items, they are kind of discounting biases and disparate opportunities for men and women in society, and so it's not as overt as just a dislike of women, let's say. What they found, as you can see in the figure here, is that for those faculty who were randomly assigned to read the application attributed to John, the male candidate, their modern sexism scores did not matter in terms of their overall evaluations. However, for those who were randomly assigned to the female candidate condition, you can see that the higher they were in modern sexism, the less favorable they were toward Jennifer, the female applicant. And so certainly, I think that those findings are incredibly important in demonstrating that even among folks who are highly educated, presumably motivated to take the best person into their labs and to give everyone an equal chance based on their credentials, we still see evidence of gender bias affecting job opportunities for women. So next, turn to some research that I have been part of with my collaborator Mickey Hebel at Rice University and a couple of her graduate students, Christy Nitrauer and Rachel Trump-Steele, as well as their statistics colleague David Lane and our collaborator Virginia Valian from Hunter College in New York. Virginia Valian probably being best known for her book Why So Slow, about the progress of women in the sciences. So we've seen that getting a job can have some disparities for men and for women. But what about keeping that job? And what kinds of things does one need in order to keep an academic research job? We started thinking about the various credentials that one needs for promotion and tenure purposes. And the one that we decided to focus on was giving major research talks at universities, so giving a colloquium talk at a major research university. We chose that because when you think about the different criteria for promotion and tenure, certainly giving a colloquium at a prestigious university has important implications for tenure and promotion decisions, for merit pay, for retaining faculty. And the reason for that is that colloquia, especially at prestigious research universities, are an important means for establishing one's reputation as a scholar. It gives sort of some street cred to people to be able to give talks at major universities, and of course gives people an opportunity to connect with potential collaborators and to get feedback on their work that can be very valuable in helping shape their careers. So that was our focus in this research, and our main question really was just whether male versus female faculty give more colloquium talks. We didn't want to rely just on self-report. Rather, we focused on data that we obtained through university websites. Oftentimes, various universities will publish their colloquium speaker list for each given year. And so we turned to the top 50 research universities in the United States as selected by U.S. News and World Report. It's certainly a popular method of obtaining information about rankings. We focused on 6 different disciplines, 6 different types of departments, and we selected them on the basis of their being known for their gender parity relative to other fields. So for example, we wouldn't want to take a look at whether men are giving more talks than women in a very male-dominated field like mechanical engineering, for example, because of course they would be. So we selected very intentionally fields where, at least in terms of the number of PhDs that are awarded per year, there is relative gender parity. We then went to those top 50 universities and examined those 6 different departments' websites, scouring them for their seminars and events page. for the year 2013 to 2014. So this was a pretty arduous kind of task. We went through and collected information from all of these websites, and we were primarily interested in whether the speakers were male or female. In terms of our results, our first hypothesis was supported. We were able, first of all, to identify over 3,600 speakers across these different universities and departments, and overall men gave over twice as many talks as women. 69% of the talks that we coded were from men and 31% were from women. Now, of course, these are observational data. We can't infer causality from them, and so we wanted to try to rule out alternative explanations for this gender disparity. Perhaps, despite the fact that these were fields where there's relative gender parity in who gets degrees, maybe there are more men represented in the fields themselves in academia. Maybe those men were more likely to be at Tier 1 institutions. Perhaps they were more likely to be senior professors and be invited for such talks. So we took a look at these data a little bit more closely, coding for these various alternative explanations. And so we went back to the pool of possible speakers to collect data to see what we could try to control for. And so here we took a look at all of the faculty from the top 100 universities in the country, across those 6 different programs, and across all academic ranks, assistant, associate, and full professor, excluding any person that we had already included in our speaker database. And so this yielded a very large sample, as you can see. And the departments themselves varied dramatically in terms of their gender representation, with some departments being as low as 22% women and some being as balanced as 47% women. So with those data, we were able to then control for various alternative explanations that I've already mentioned. And what we found is that even when we controlled for those different alternative explanations, we still found that the gender effect persisted, such that for every talk that women were giving, men were giving about 1.2 talks, and that was across these different disciplines: biology, bioengineering, political science, psychology, sociology, and history. So we still had some questions, though, because again, that doesn't offer causal information. We were able to rule out some alternative explanations, but trying to anticipate sort of the usual arguments for this. Maybe women are less aware of the importance of giving colloquium talks. We know that there's some research documenting disparities in terms of mentoring. So if they're getting poor mentoring, maybe they don't know how important it is to give colloquium talks. Furthermore, some folks have raised the argument about women declining such invitations because maybe they have greater family responsibilities at home. And so we conducted a survey from these same institutions, asking male and female faculty across these different disciplines about their perceived importance of giving colloquium talks at major universities, how important that is for their promotion and tenure, and about the frequency with which they decline those kinds of invitations. And in both cases, we found that there was no significant difference between male and female faculty. So it's not the case that women did not realize the importance of giving colloquium talks. It's not the case that they were declining those invitations more frequently than men. So we still wondered if there were further alternative explanations, and although it was really impossible with this kind of procedure for us to directly assess implicit biases, or really to know for certain that we were contacting the exact person who invited all of those different speakers and give them some sort of modern sexism scale or something like that, where we could get a sense of their individual biases, we did use gender as a proxy in terms of, are there gender biases with regard to gatekeepers? Who are the gatekeepers in this study? Those are the folks who are doing the inviting. So in order for people to go and be able to give these prestigious colloquia, they need to be invited. And so we contacted all of the administrators from the various departments that we had focused on in our original study. We had a 21% response rate, so a total of 91 administrators responded to our survey, asking them simply how these decisions were handled within their department. And for some departments, it's handled by an individual. They decide who gets invited for colloquia. For others, they're handled by committee. And regardless whether it's an individual or a committee making the decision regarding whom to invite, having a woman helps to reduce this bias, although not entirely eliminated, as you'll see. So when there is an individual making the decision, we can see that when that individual gatekeeper was a woman, 49% of the time they sponsored women speakers compared to 30% of the time for men sponsoring women speakers. So that did help shrink the bias to have a woman in charge of making those decisions. And likewise, we see that when the committee was when the decision was made by a committee rather than an individual, the greater the representation of women on that committee, the greater the likelihood that there would be a female speaker invited. Although that's a marginally significant relationship, and so again, I'd like to point out that as we've seen in this previous study by Monster-Cusin and colleagues, it's not the case that women themselves are without bias, but I would argue that at least having greater diversity on one selection committee can attenuate these effects somewhat. So as you can see so far, I've highlighted some important disparities with regard to gender in academic positions, in particular within research-focused academic positions. I wanted to finish with one study that does specifically look at implicit bias in this domain. And this study was conducted and published by Ernesto Rubin and his colleagues, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2014. And what they did was conduct an experiment in which they asked participants to predict the performance of men and women on a math task for which women and men are known to perform equally well, despite those strong stereotypes favoring men. And so because it was more of a controlled experiment, they were able to assess participants' implicit associations of men versus women with STEM versus liberal arts. Now, it looked like from the survey that many people have taken the IAT before, and of course there are various types of IATs. The one that they used in their research was a gender STEM IAT. For folks who are unfamiliar with the IAT, it is a computerized reaction time task. So the computer is assessing how quickly participants are able to categorize different stimuli from the time it's presented until the time they correctly make that categorization. And so it's recording things in milliseconds, the responses in milliseconds, and so we're talking about gut reactions basically to different categories and their pairings. So as we can see on the left, these are some screenshots here that illustrate what the gender STEM IAT might have looked like for these participants. In this task on the left, we can see that participants would have been instructed there to press a key on the left of their keyboard if the stimulus that pops up, either faces or words, represented the category male or the category science and math. And they were instructed to press a key on the right of their keyboard if the stimulus was a female face or a word that represented the liberal arts. And so, for example, chemistry might pop up, and participants, of course, would very quickly press the key on the left to indicate that that is a science and math term. In opposite trials, trials that are stereotypically incompatible, the same thing happens, but here participants, as you can see, have their categories switched for them. And so in this case, participants would have been asked to press a key on the left if the stimulus is a female face or a science and math term, and to press a key on the right if the stimulus is a male face or a liberal arts term. And so math might be an example that would pop up, and of course participants would press the key on the left to indicate that that's a science and math term. The reason for this comparison is so that we can see how fast people are to make associations that are stereotypically compatible, in other words, consistent with what society tells us about men's and women's abilities in science and in liberal arts, versus stereotypically incompatible. And so what we find across the board in my own research and in others, many others' research, is that people are significantly faster, most people are significantly faster to respond for these stereotypically compatible trials than for the stereotypically incompatible trials, suggesting that they implicitly associate men with science and math and women with liberal arts rather than the reverse. So these participants evaluated the potential of men and women on this math task, and they engaged in a gender STEM implicit association test. And what the researchers here were interested in is looking at the extent to which participants' implicit associations scored along the x-axis here, such that higher numbers indicate a stronger association between men and science and math and women and liberal arts than the reverse. Whether that predicts the difference in expected performance between male and female candidates. And so their findings revealed that the more implicitly biased participants were, the more likely they were to predict a disparity in men's and women's performance favoring men. They expected men to significantly outperform women, even on this task that was known to have no gender differences. So here a very clear demonstration of the role of implicit biases in expectations about men and women in the STEM domain. So just to kind of wrap up, since we want to save plenty of time for discussion, what I've tried to show you here in terms of some takeaways are that subtle and even implicit gender biases are pervasive in STEM. They're held among even highly educated people, even among people with that are well-intentioned. I don't think that there's a conspiracy against women in these studies. And they're held even by women themselves. Again, kind of underscoring just how pervasive these biases are. We're just sponges for our environments, basically, and so these messages that women are less good in STEM are just very pervasive. And of course, as we can see here, these biases have unintended but very important direct effects on career-related outcomes. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and give a shout out to my lab. And this has my contact information here in case you would like to get in touch later on. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ashburn-Nardo. That was really interesting. If you're interested in reading more of Dr. Ashburn-Nardo's research, we've highlighted some of her more recent articles at the end of this PowerPoint. And there's also some information listed on your references handout, which can be found in that box folder. So we're going to start with some guiding questions to frame this conversation. The first one, I just wanted to run through the information on this slide. So the question is, much of the research on implicit bias in STEM focuses on gender and racial bias. How does implicit bias in STEM impact non-traditional, international, and first-generation students? So the following statistics are from the U.S. Higher Education website. This is from 2017. So for first-generation college students, again, this is in 2017, there were 10.3 million college applicants. Pell Grant recipients, that's 7.6 million college student recipients. College students over the age of 25, which is going to be more of your non-traditional student, 1.8 million college students. For ethnic and racial minority students, there were 3 million Hispanic college students, 2.4 million African American college students, 1 million Asian college students. Lastly, for female students, 11.7. So we're going to invite you to use the hand raising function. It's right under, if you look at where your name is on the top, there's a little hand. And if you would like to chime in on this or talk about some of your experiences, that would be great. So you could go ahead and click the hand raising function, and we'll take a couple comments before we move on to the next slide.
And I'll just add, if you have an experience that has happened to you maybe outside of a STEM discipline, you're certainly welcome to share that as well.
Great. So Lauren, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Cool. I recently learned that you can check how many students and like the demographic of which students are dropping classes, and there are significantly higher rates for minority students dropping classes than dominant race.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Does anyone else want to comment on this?
We do have a comment in the chat box asking what research is being done on other historically underrepresented populations. I'm particularly interested in LGBT issues. So that is a great question. Much of the research in STEM has focused predominantly on gender, on bias and issues with gender. There is some research out there about bias and stereotype threat as it pertains to racial minorities. There's much less out there on LGBT issues, particularly because of the numbers. So you need, because there are fewer students who are in this population, it's harder to run a study to get statistically significant results. So that's one of the reasons. I do know of a couple. I know of one exploratory study that used qualitative data interviewing LGBTQIA students in a biology class that we could share with you in a follow-up from the CIRTL cast. But other than that, there isn't as much, again, simply because of the numbers.
And if anyone knows of any resources related to that, please feel free to share them in the chat window as well.
And then we have another comment for the female student statistic. How many were women of color?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, we're not sure.
To my memory, I don't think that was listed in a plain site as these statistics here, but that's a really interesting question. We can look into that too for follow-up, especially for those who join our next session.
If I may chime in really quickly here, these are excellent questions that are being posed by our viewers. What I feel like they're getting at is the importance of belonging and feeling that sense of belonging in a STEM class or in any class, frankly. And so particularly with regard to, well, for any underrepresented group, but I'm thinking especially about the person who asked about LGBT students and their any disparities that have been documented for them within STEM. One thing that's going to be particularly challenging is seeing other people who are like you in those disciplines, like having a role model that you can emulate in those disciplines, unless people disclose, right? It's a stigmatized identity that is concealable for many people, and so I'm imagining if I were a student in that situation and wondered if other folks shared that identity with me, it would perhaps be very hard to tell, and I could feel very isolated unless that teacher happened to feel comfortable disclosing. Likewise, I think the question about how many of the students, the female students, were women of color speaks to an important issue with regard to intersectionality. And so certainly people have more than one identity that is important to them oftentimes. And we are only, I think, beginning now to take that into consideration with regard to research. So it's a little bit slower to make that progress, but there is some emerging literature out there on who can serve as good role models and good allies for women of color in particular. So folks who have that double stigma of the gender identity and racial identity. And of course we know that there are few women faculty of color to serve as role models within STEM contexts, and so my colleague and collaborator Eva Pietri will be sharing some of her research on the ability of men and white women to serve as allies potentially for those students until we can get the numbers up in those disciplines. And I believe she is presenting in our fourth CIRTL session, if I'm not mistaken. Correct me if I'm wrong here.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you, Dr. Ashburn-Nardo. I also received a comment in the chat box that said this person was really happy that Pell Grant stuff was represented. With regard to intersectionality, that is a conversation that's going to be held and really focused on in a future CIRTL cast. We really hope you can join us for some of the upcoming sessions. We're going to take one more comment and then move on because we have several questions and we're kind of short on time. So Michael, if you'd like to speak.
Michael, I see you're joining us from a mobile device. You should have a microphone icon towards the top of your screen. If you click that, we'll be able to hear you. If you're not in a place where you can speak up, you can type your question or comment into the chat window.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Loud and clear, thanks.
Okay. I've read that the IAT has been criticized as being both not repeatable, meaning the same person takes it a month later and they get a very different score, and also not predictive, that there's no causal relationship established between whatever your score is on the IAT and whether you engage in discriminatory behavior. And I'm wondering what your panel has to say about that.
Hi, thanks for that question, Michael. Yes, I think like any measure, the IAT, in particular because of all the public attention it garnered early on when it first came out, has been the subject of a lot of criticism. I've been using the IAT in my own research, not as the be-all, end-all. I use it as just any other measure and subject it to the same kind of critical rigor that I would expect any kind of measure. I don't think it's a perfect measure, but in my work and in lots of others' work, there is solid evidence of it predicting important discriminatory outcomes. Even discriminatory outcomes that often are not captured by explicit measures. And so there's some nice meta-analyses that are available in the literature. I can provide some references that perhaps they can post in the box for you if you're interested in those. With regard to its reliability, actually that's one place that I think the IAT fares very well from test-retest reliability. We're talking about correlation coefficients of like 0.6-ish. So considering how noisy reaction time data are to begin with, I think those are pretty impressive numbers. Again, it sort of depends on what kind of IAT one is talking about, and so you know, there are certainly situations that can influence people's IAT scores. They are not set in stone. So those are some things to keep under consideration as well, but I'm happy to provide some additional references about that. Like you, I was a skeptic when it first came out, and that was really the beginning of my graduate research career, was trying to figure out like what's going on with this IAT thing.
Thank you, Leslie, for that very informative answer. So we had another question in the chat box, which I'll just touch on briefly. What about people with disabilities? So this is something that we can comment more on in the next session, and Catlin's going to be looking into resources. But one thing that I'll just say about that is that it probably depends on the type of disability. If you have someone who has an apparent physical disability, that might be kind of evident, whereas someone has, if you have a student, say, with ADHD, that might be really difficult to tell, and say that student is not doing well in your course, you might just blame it on, oh, well, they just can't manage their time, or they're just lazy. You know, these typical assumptions that we sort of fall into, rather than taking a step back and maybe having a conversation with that student and asking, okay, well what's going on? What can you tell me about? So with that, I would say it probably depends on the type of disability. And again, I don't think there's been much research pertaining to disabilities and how that impacts implicit bias in STEM. But again, Catlin can look into resources for that. So our next two questions, one focuses on the ways that implicit biases are reflected in STEM higher education at the micro and macro levels. In the interest of time, we're going to skip over this question since we highlighted a lot of the research, and Dr. Ashburn-Nardo spoke a lot about the research pertaining to this. And we're also going to skip over this question, which talks about, and you can see here, these types of implicit bias are explained in these boxes down here. Forms of implicit bias in STEM include the prove it again, tightrope, maternal wall, tug of war, and isolation, and how these biases impact underrepresented students and faculty. Again, we highlighted a lot of the research and we have a lot of references. So again, in the interest of time, we're going to go now to the fourth question, which is implicit bias can manifest in the form of microaggressions. So again, these are sort of subtle derogatory comments that are directed towards marginalized groups. And so how do these impact STEM teaching and learning, and what are some strategies that we can use to combat them?
So we are asking that you use the whiteboard for this conversation. There's an icon that we've mentioned in the right-hand corner here. So if you look right to where, if you have a video screen of us, there's a little panel right below that. You can click on that text box. You can also raise your hand, but we probably want to kick it off with some whiteboard comments, if you don't mind. Also, I encourage you to use your empty outline that we have in that box folder. And as for the 2 questions that we've had to skip over in the interest of time, that's also included in the PowerPoint that is in your box folder.
And given the size of the crowd today, we might see this whiteboard fill up pretty quickly. If that happens, I do want to encourage people to raise your hand so that you can speak up. And also make use of the chat window as well. Feel free to do that too.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and give you a second to type, and then we will regroup in about a minute or so.
Okay, so we're getting a number of comments here, so I'm going to try to organize the screen a little bit so we can see them. So if I can move this box. So strategies, using inclusive examples when you're doing problems in the class. So maybe not just using examples that are typically from the perspective of a white male or a white female. And paying attention when you're forming groups, teams, so making them as inclusive as possible. Yeah, groups. The formation of groups can really impact the things like peer grading. So I know there's been a study in the biology education research literature regarding the makeup of groups. So generally, if you had a group that had more female members in it, that positively impact like the perception of other members in terms of things like peer grading. We have another comment, implicit bias leads to low expectations. That's another thing that we've seen a lot from the literature, is that instructors will have lower expectations for marginalized groups than groups that are from from the majority. Students will feel alienated, so a strategy that this person uses is provide means for anonymous feedback. Yeah. That is a great strategy. A lot of these issues are very delicate. Students might be afraid that even though you're trying to do your best to show that you have good intentions, they don't know how you're going to react. So this is a good way for them to give you that feedback. Moving over to some of the comments on the right, students may feel hesitant to speak in class or advocate for themselves. So you can include team activities for smaller groups and highlight the contributions of all groups to a project. Sure, so having a smaller scale sort of activity so that they can find another way to participate. Mm-hmm.
In TA training too, we talked about breaking large classes into small groups, assigning mm-hmm. someone as a reporter and someone else as an individual to speak out on behalf of that group. Mm-hmm. So. We have a comment here of try to call on people from underrepresented populations ahead of people from dominant groups. So yeah, that's certainly a strategy, especially because we're actually less likely to call on students of color
over white students. So you could do that. You could also, if the class is small enough, try to call on everybody, or try to ensure some sort of equitable participation, such as using an audience response system like Top Hat.
We also avoid calling on people whose names we can't pronounce. So that's another thing too, just to take the time to learn your students' names, especially if you're in a teaching capacity.
And I think we'll go over about one more comment before our final question, since we are short on time. We have a couple of people who commented that faculty don't want to mentor students of color because they're perceived as needing more time to mentor. So again, that goes back to this other comment of we expect students of color, we expect them to perform at a lower level, we expect them to need more help, and so because of that implicit bias, we tend not to want them in our labs as much.
So we apologize if we haven't been able to get to all the comments. There have been some great comments here. We're really excited about your participation. So we wanted to do a quick wrap up, if we have time. I don't know, do we have time for a wrap up?
We'll take about 1 minute.
To see if there's one key concept that you've learned in today's session, go ahead and use the whiteboard function. I also encourage you, again, feel free to write on the whiteboard. I'm just going to keep talking a bit too. We also invite you to join our next sessions. It's not necessary that you attend each one, but they do kind of go together. So we will have another session coming up next Monday at the same time.
Yeah, and again, if you can't attend that one or even the third one, even if you can only attend the fourth one, you can definitely come back in week 4. But we hope you can make it to all of them. So we have one key concept, gender bias in STEM is still alive and well. Yeah.
Dr. Ashburn-Nardo, do you have anything you want to add as I know we're going to run out of time?
Sure. I just encourage people to take advantage of visiting the implicit.harvard.edu website and examining some of their own biases. I think sometimes it's very hard for us to want to acknowledge biases that we hold within ourselves, but it can be a very very meaningful, very poignant kind of learning moment, and biases are malleable. Like I said, they're not set in stone, and so the good news is that, as I'm sure we'll learn over the coming sessions, there are ways that we can reduce our biases through exposure to others who share different identities than we do, for example, through attending cultural events where we learn to be more accepting of cultures that we may be less familiar with, by reading and immersing ourselves in books that are written from different perspectives than what our own group memberships provide for us. So there are ways to work on our own implicit biases and to reduce them, and simply being aware is a good first start, but there's more work that's required.
Thank you, Leslie. I just wanted to highlight a couple of comments before we moved on to some concluding slides. So we had one comment about surprised to see how severely gender bias affects even women. So yeah, we think about women like, okay, there's a lot of women in science now, we're starting to see women in positions of leadership. This is no longer a problem. It's actually a problem, and it's quite literally everywhere. And then we had another comment, a couple of people I think commented, was super surprised to learn how biased women are against women in STEM. So this is a really important thing. So it's not just the people in the majority who have the implicit bias. It's not just white males. Everybody has implicit bias. So you can be a person of color with bias against people of color. You can be a woman and have a bias against other women. It's not just limited to one person, and it's due to these sort of stereotypes and societal expectations. And thinking about how severe the gender bias is against women, there hasn't been as much research in terms of racial bias or bias against students in the LGBTQIA community. So those groups tend to be more marginalized than women. So we can expect, and there's been some studies that have documented that those groups are are marginalized to a more severe extent. So when you start to think about it with regards to other groups, it is a very large problem. So with that, thank you all for coming. And again, we hope to see you in future sessions.
Yes, and then there's, again, a list of references in the box folder. Kate, I don't know if you have any closing comments that you would like to add.
Yeah, I just want to let folks know that the resources that we talked about in today's event, including that box folder, are all linked on the event website. I also want to encourage people to fill out our brief post-event evaluation. I will go ahead and put the link to that in the chat window. And as you heard, there are a number of events happening in the rest of this series, and I want to encourage folks to RSVP to attend those as well, since a lot of what we talked about today isn't exclusively in today's topic. The things we started asking questions about today will come up throughout the entire series. So thanks so much for everyone for attending today. Thanks for your time, and thanks to our hosts and our speaker today as well.